So we've talked all about sexual selection and the effects that it can have not just on phenotype but on behavior. We've looked at altruism as another example of how natural selection can be used to explain behavior patterns. One of the things I hope this has done is help to get rid of the perception that survival of the fittest is survival of the meanest and survival of the most ruthless and heartless, survival of only the most savage predators that eat what they kill, like the savage lions tearing apart a helpless gazelle on the Serengeti or whatever it is. That there are lots of cases all the time where cooperative behavior is actually what's favored by selection. There are plenty of cases where cooperative guys do in fact finish first, and we can understand reasons why that's the case. But to what extent does this apply to people? The use of evolutionary reasoning to explain behavioral sciences of humans is called sociobiology, or applied to humans, it's now more usually called evolutionary psychology. The idea behind evolutionary psychology is, first of all, that you can treat the mind as modular, that the mind can be divided up into different functional parts that do different things, and that what those modules do has been shaped by natural selection, primarily natural selection taking place over the hundreds of thousands of years before we had a civilization. People have only been living in cities for less than 10,000 years. The oldest fossils that we have that belong to our own species are a little over 300,000 years old. And before that, there were not quite Homo sapiens relatives of ours going back a couple of millions of years. So almost all of the time that our lineage has been on this planet, we were living as hunter-gatherers, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, hunting animals and gathering wild plants, living in little family groups. And our ancestors did that for millions of years before any of them sat down and finally decided that it was time to invent indoor plumbing. So our brains, say the evolutionary psychologists, are adapted to situations that would be encountered in this hunter-gatherer lifestyle that we lived in for millions of years before the very recent, relatively, invention of writing and cities and World of Warcraft and atomic weapons and all of the things, the great benefits of civilization that we enjoy. The field was launched in 1975 by a gent named E.O. Wilson, probably best known for this, but his other major field has been in evolution of ants. He is an entomologist and the ant specialist at Harvard University. And in this book, Sociobiology, he tried to use evolutionary reasoning, looking for, cases of variation, selection causing change. Most of it's not that controversial because most of it focused on other species, but the last couple of chapters focus on people. That set off a real storm of controversy that kind of reached its critical mass in 1978 at a conference held by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Wilson was about to get up to make a speech, and student protesters from a group called Students for a Democratic Society rushed the stage, and one of them grabbed the pitcher of ice water that the speakers were given and dumped it on his head, yelling, "You're all wet." Why were people so upset about this? Most scientists don't, with the possible exception of Anthony Fauci, most scientists don't tend to draw that kind of hatred. What made this a major issue was that Wilson was being accused of, well, racism and sexism, but more generally, biological determinism. That's the idea that humans will and must inevitably act and behave in certain ways because of their biological nature. Um, that human free will is not entirely free, that human behavior is not infinitely malleable. You can't shape the way humans behave by culture and education. At least you can't indefinitely. That ultimately humans will act and behave in certain ways because evolution has shaped their behavioral tendencies. We behave the way they do in some part because we evolved to behave that way. The prevailing opinion at the time in anthropology and sociology was that virtually all of human custom is learned. That if a people are warlike, they are warlike and aggressive because their culture has taught them to be warlike and aggressive. And if we can teach them to be different, they will, if we do it right, they will start behaving differently. If there is a culture that oppresses its women, that is purely because of their culture. And if we can change the culture and change the ways that the younger generations are taught, then the position of women will rise. People will learn to behave in different ways. Nobody's saying that this is completely impossible, but Wilson argued that there's ultimately a limit to it. As he put it, the genes hold culture on a leash. The leash is very long. You can still change cultures in lots of ways, and sometimes you should, and sometimes you have to. But inevitably, values will be constrained in accordance with their effects on the human gene pool. The brain is a product of evolution. Human behavior, like the deepest capacities for emotional response, which drive and guide it, is the circuitous technique by which human genetic material has been and will be kept intact. People behave in certain ways or tend to behave in certain ways because in the past, people that behaved in that way left more offspring than people that didn't. And so our natural tendencies to act the way that we do have been shaped by natural selection, much of it taking place in a very different environment from the one that you or I know. That's why they were dumping a pitcher of water on his head. It is quite true that human behavior is ridiculously complicated compared to other species. We do all kinds of weird shit that no other primate has ever even conceived of, as far as we know. And it's also extremely plastic. People behave in different ways and have different customs and different languages and different ways of organizing society, um, all over the world. And a lot of this does seem to depend on your learning and your culture. I picked this as just a neat example of how unfathomably complicated human behavior is. I don't know of any other animal species of which you could ever say, woman in sumo wrestler suit assaulted her ex-girlfriend in a gay pub after she waved at a man dressed as a Snickers bar. Okay, you're not going to find that among any other species. Nobody else has ever invented sumo wrestling suits or Snicker costumes or gay pubs. So human behavior is very complex. It's very plastic. It is very modifiable. And much of it does seem to depend on learning. We have the option of behaving in ways that would make no sense on the Serengeti plain 300,000 years ago. In fact, we already do behave that way. And here's why he got a pitcher of water dumped on his head. The idea that people are biologically predestined to behave in certain ways has been used for exceptionally vicious ends. Um, During the time of slavery and the Jim Crow era after that, there were any number of medical doctors that would come up with reasons for affirming why Black people were incapable of behaving with restraint and reason and were basically just big children, um, who had to be indulged and tolerated and periodically hung from damn trees. We've got a long history in this country of using biological arguments to argue that certain people are predestined to act in certain ways. Here's a Nazi propaganda poster where a hand is pulling back the curtain on Der Jude, the Jew. Like, I thought there was more than one. But you can see he's drawn as physically different, physically kind of repulsive with those, hanging jowls and big hooked nose. But he's called Kriegsanstifter, Kriegsverlängerer, the instigator of war, the prolonger of war. He is not just physically different, but he's, innately destined to behave in ways that cause misery unless proper Germans rise up and do something about it. So you see, arguing that this is why Wilson caught all that flack in the 1970s, because the idea that people behave in certain ways because they're biologically predisposed to behaving in certain ways has been used as a damn bludgeon in the past. A lot, often. Memories of this are still fresh. There are cases where it's still being used like that today. And that means you have to be very careful about advancing hypotheses because they can lead you into some very unsavory territory. Oh, I'll give you another example. We already talked about Bateman's rule, the idea that the sex that has less to invest in reproduction, which is usually but not always males, will maximize fitness by reproducing as much as possible. The sex that has more to invest will maximize reproductive output by being choosy and selecting males of high quality. Now, if you look at humans, for a human female to successfully reproduce, she has to carry an embryo for 9 months, and he will drain a lot of her energy and make her tired and sit on her bladder and suck calcium right out of her bones. And then the baby gets born, and then there's nursing. So it takes a huge amount of metabolic and physical effort for a woman to have a baby. For a man to have a baby takes about a teaspoon of fluid and 2 minutes of his time. Well, hopefully longer than 2 minutes, but not always. Let's get real here. And so it's been argued that this means that men are biologically adapted to be promiscuous and women are biologically adapted to be coy. This in turn has gone on to get weaponized in the pickup artist community. There is kind of a community that's flourished on the internet of men that want to have sex with lots of women and have developed this repertoire of kind of psychological tricks that supposedly, I've never tried them, and I don't recommend it, but they supposedly work because they play on women's supposed evolutionary role. There are ways that you can, trick women into sleeping with you because you can broadcast that you're a male of high genetic quality. And they use evolutionary psychology in justifying these techniques. And that, you could argue that Hugh Hefner is, of course, just doing what comes naturally because he is a male of high status, because he's got a mansion and a lot of money. And I don't know if you remember this. This was a reality TV show. Hugh Hefner was the publisher of Playboy, and he was dating 3 blondes at one time that were all living with him and having sex with him. Okay, and you could, you could justify this kind of behavior by saying that this is simply what's natural. That Hugh Hefner has, has evolved in such a way that he wants sexual variety, and he's got the resources to get it, and his mates are, um, well, presumably quite fertile. They look like they could have lots of babies given the opportunity. And you could argue that arrangements like this are, scientifically approved. And some would consider this to be a false argument, that behavior like this might be immoral or unsavory or, very certainly sexist. Certainly in the case of the pickup artist community, it's taken some very toxic dimensions indeed. And going back even a little further, it's very easy to use evolution to tell what one of my old professors used to call just so stories. I don't know if you folks ever got the original Just So stories. They were written by the British author Rudyard Kipling, and they were kids' stories that explained why different animals had the features that they did. So, in a long time ago, in the high and far off times, the elephant had no trunk. Elephants just had a kind of lumpy nose. But there was a young elephant that was very curious and asked a lot of questions. And finally, he wanted to know, what does the crocodile eat for dinner? So he went to the banks of the great green, greasy Limpopo River and asked the crocodile. And the crocodile said, "Come close and I'll tell you." So the elephant's child got really close, and the crocodile grabbed the elephant's nose and pulled it and stretched it out into a trunk. And then the elephant discovered that this was very useful because he could use it to pick things up. So there's stories like that. The original Just So stories were stories about, you know, how animals got features that they did. And one of my old professors used to use the term Just So stories to mean evolutionary explanations that sound really good, but that have never been properly tested and maybe can't be properly tested. And it's very, very easy to use evolutionary arguments to come up with just so stories. Stories that we tell ourselves about human behavior that sound plausible, but turn out to be either wrong or incoherent. A paper came out in 2017. Residents of the United Kingdom of European descent were asked to compare paired blocks of color. You can see these 5 blocks of color down here on the x-axis, and select, you're given 2 blocks of color and you select which one you like best. Here's what they found. UK females, this very strong peak around here, strongly preferred red and pink shades, these shades down here. Men had much less strong liking for red and pinks, and they tended to prefer bluish and greenish shades up here, right? Women over there, men over there. Okay, so British women tend to like pink a little more. British men tend to like blue and green a little more. Hurlbut and Ling proposed that among our hunter-gatherer ancestors in the high and far off times on the savannas of Africa, when we look at societies like this today that still have this lifestyle, or that did until recently, it's called the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And typically, with exceptions, the men tend to do the hunting, at least the hunting of the big game. It's the men that will go out and try to shoot antelope or bison or whatever the large, tasty animals might be. They'll go out and do the hunting. And the women specialize in the gathering, typically of plant foods. There may be some hunts where both sexes participate. Um, Native Americans used to have co-ed rabbit hunts in some parts of the US, but by and large, men hunt and women gather. And they suggested that being really sensitive to red was adaptive for females because women have to know when to pick ripe fruits and berries, many of which turn red when they are at their prime. So, yeah, get that again. Women who really liked shades of red and were really good at discriminating, telling the difference between shades of red, would collect more food for their families and thus have more babies than women that didn't like red or didn't care about red. So here you've got the hunter-gatherer theory proposes that female brains should be specialized for gathering-related tasks. Trichromacy, that's the ability, that's having 3 different color receptors. And the LM opponent channel, which is how you tell red from green, are modern adaptations in primate evolution thought to have evolved to facilitate the identification of ripe yellow fruit or edible red leaves embedded in green foliage. As a gatherer, the female would also need to be more aware of color information than the hunter. They also proposed that there was a need to discriminate subtle changes in skin color due to emotional states and social sexual signals. Females may have honed these adaptations for their role as caregivers. Excuse me. So here we got a female who you can see is showing some blushing on her face right there, and of course right there. And women, of course, being the emotional mediators, have to be more sensitive because they're the ones that keep the family together. Men must hunt mammoth, no time for emotion, not show emotion, kill big furry thing with spear, drag back to cave. Not emotional, not in touch with emotion. Only get in touch with emotion when drunk and hugging buddies and say, I love you, man. No emotion otherwise. Okay, that was an attempt at a joke that may or may not have gone over very well. It's hard to tell when you're talking to a screen. And so the idea is that women that were able to distinguish um, and focus on shades of red and pink were likelier to have more offspring than women that couldn't, because women that could see pink very well would be better able at taking care of people and um, understanding people's emotional states and being empathetic and being caring. I hope you get the point that this is, this is probably drawn more on stereotyping than anything else. There's no particular reason why men can't be sensitive. And here's what blows this out of the water as far as I'm concerned. When the researchers did the same thing with Chinese test subjects, the difference went away. There's very little difference between the preference of Chinese women and Chinese men in colors. The Chinese women's favorite color is over here. The men's favorite color is over here. And look at those error bars. They overlap quite a bit. There's very little difference between Chinese men and Chinese women in color preference. Now, you could come up with some sort of stupid argument that Chinese women aren't emotionally sensitive, or Chinese fruit doesn't turn red, or something stupid like that. But the reason almost certainly has everything to do with culture and nothing to do with genes. If you've ever eaten in a real Chinese restaurant, you've probably noticed red banners everywhere. Red is associated with good luck and good fortune. In Chinese families, if you grew up in a Chinese family, every Chinese New Year, your older relatives probably gave you presents of money in red paper envelopes. Like if seeing red paper envelopes means you're going to be able to buy that Xbox, you're probably going to grow up really, really liking red. And so in the Chinese population, that radical difference between liking pinks and reds and liking blues mostly goes away. And again, we can probably explain that as having everything to do with culture. Doesn't look like it has a lot to do with biology. There's no reason to think that, Chinese women are less emotionally sensitive than others, or that, Chinese fruit is less likely to be red at the peak of ripeness. I know of no evidence for any of those. I know of nothing that would have shaped the sensory systems of different races in that way, and have to conclude that it's got everything to do with culture. And incidentally, it's not even true in the West. That preference for boys in blue and girls in pink only dates back to about 1940. Uh, this is a picture from about the year 1500 of the Virgin Mary with the infant Jesus. And you'll notice that the Virgin Mary is wearing blue. That is her traditional color. In church art, that's how you tell who the Virgin Mary is. She's always wearing blue robes. The only female character that's consistently wearing red or pink is Mary Magdalene, who was, this is not perfectly biblical, but she was interpreted as, a repentant prostitute, one of Jesus's followers who had been a prostitute and repented to join him, she's always depicted as wearing red. You know, there's a reason we used to have expressions like scarlet woman for a woman who is promiscuous. Red used to be seen as frankly kind of a slutty color, and blue was traditionally the color of, female virtue and purity. Whereas for boys, it used to be very common to dress them in pink because it was a slightly toned down version of red, which used to be seen as this very macho, fiery, very active, aggressive sort of color. So before about 1940, nobody really strictly followed this rule of blue for boys and pink for girls. Now it gets followed because the main reason is that it boosts toy sales. Like if you have a boy child and buy him the boy set of Legos that's mostly blue, I've seen this, you can spot this in Target. And then your next child's a girl, then what they'll do now is market these sets of pink Legos that are just for girls, so that you don't just give your your boy child's old Legos. You have to go out and buy more Legos that are pink because she's a girl. And that is entirely something that's come into existence over the past couple of decades. We have no real evidence that these preferences have any genetic basis at all, and we can actually, see that they've only arisen very, very recently. And that's what I mean by a just so story. It's easy to come up with a fact about human nature, like European men born in the UK like greens and blues more, you know, UK women like reds and pinks more. Okay, that's presumably a fact. And then spin this great evolutionary explanation for why it's so, and why all of humanity must follow that rule because it was built into us when we were being shaped by natural selection, living as hunter gatherers on the Serengeti plain. It's very easy to come up with a plausible sounding explanation that turns out to crumble when you look at it more critically. And evolutionary psychology is not necessarily wrong, but there's been a lot of utter crap that's been proposed under its banner, where you come up with some quirk of human behavior, and construct a beautiful evolutionary explanation for it, and then never get around to actually testing it. And very often, a lot of this work is based on, Westerners, people that grew up in Europe and America. And someone once said that Westerners are weird, WEIRD, which stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with being those. I mean, I'm weird, and I guess I'm pretty glad that I'm weird. I'm used to being weird, but most of humanity isn't weird. Most of humanity doesn't live in the Western countries. At least until very recently, most of humanity was not formally educated. In many places, they still aren't. Most of the world has not been industrialized, or if it has been, it was very recently. Most people aren't rich, and most systems of government aren't exactly democratic. So conclusions based on what American college students do are not necessarily representative of what the true human condition is. You always have to be very careful when someone says humanity evolved to do this, because very often their sample is a sample of American college students. Not that there's anything wrong with being American college students. I mean, I'm sure that you folks don't object to being American college students. There's nothing bad about that. But the culture that you're embedded in and the society that you're a part of is not necessarily representative of all humans everywhere. There are some cases where evolutionary psych seems to work as an explanation. Even here, it's not completely beyond criticism, but I'm going to show you an example where it really does seem to work. Okay, here's a mother and a baby, looks to be about a year old. And here's the thing, babies have an incredibly long childhood. Babies are born completely helpless. This is not something you find even in other primates. Baby chimps can sit upright and ride around on mommy's back within something like an hour of birth. And they can get around within, I want to say, just a couple days. Human babies, of course, don't even start walking, don't take their first steps until on average, I think it's about 1 year. Our son, of course, was a little advanced because of course he is. But yeah, a year is fairly typical. There's a whole year in which the kid can't even move. And, a couple of years where the kid can't feed himself. And, probably, 8 or 10 years before the baby is old enough that you can put them to work in the salt mines and start earning your investment back. There's a huge length of time where human parents invest an enormous amount of their energy in child raising and don't get any of it back. The relationship between parent and child is the most unequal relationship that humans know. You have to give all of this energy to somebody that, at least in the first few months, has no way of even saying thank you. And then just when you think you've got them trained, they borrow your car and never mind. Anyway, end of that rant. I'm trying not to sound bitter or anything like that. I'm not, but it is a fact that because of babies' immensely long childhood, it takes a huge investment to raise a human child. Now, parents and their biological offspring are one thing, then something gets really disturbing when you look at the difference between biological offspring and stepchildren. If you, I assume everyone knows what this is. If one parent dies or leaves, the other parent may remarry and bring in a stepfather or stepmother. And the thing about stepfathers and stepmothers is they don't share any genes with their stepchildren. They don't directly contribute to their fitness. If you're a step parent, you're going to have to invest a lot of energy to raise your stepchildren, but those stepchildren don't carry any of your DNA. They're not genetically related to you. And that sets up what Daly and Wilson 25 years ago called the Cinderella effect. I assume you know the story of Cinderella, and you know that Cinderella was very beautiful and she wanted to go to the ball, but her wicked stepmother and wicked stepsisters forced her to dress in rags and sit by the kitchen fire. So she got covered in cinders, which is why they called her that, and scrub the floor while they went off to the ball. And then, of course, the fairy godmother comes up and turns a pumpkin into a coach, and you know the rest. Daly and Wilson looked at risk factors for child abuse. Now, mercifully, child abuse is not enormously common. I mean, any amount is too much. But the single greatest risk factor for child abuse is the presence of a step parent. If you're looking at two natural parents raising a kid, the incidence of child abuse turns out to be about 1 in 10,000. When there's one step parent present, the risk of abuse is 6 times that, 6 out of 10,000 in the age bracket where the child is between 0 and 2. It does tend to go down a bit, probably as the kid grows big enough that the kid can punch back. But there's still a significant difference in the incidence of child abuse all the way up to the end of adolescence. Does this mean that every step parent's an abuser? Heck no. But it does mean that, it does show you that this is the single greatest risk factor for child abuse. The incidence of child murder measured by number of victims per million years of co-residence. What the heck is that? A year of co-residence is one child living for 1 year with either 2 biological parents or a parent and a step parent. And the incidence of child murder is 600 per million years of co-residence in step parent households, 600 times higher in that 0 to 2 age bracket in households with 1 natural parent and 1 step parent than it is in households with 2 natural parent. It's almost unheard of when both natural parents are present. Fortunately, the incidence is still relatively very low. Most step parents are able to raise kids successfully. There are step parents who have ended up being wonderful parents, and I certainly don't want to deny that. But it's been found, and this has been found, by the way, looking into a wide range of cultures. This has been found looking at people everywhere from hunter-gatherers in Tanzania to hunter-gatherers in Peru to middle-class households in New Mexico, USA. When an abusive parent has both biological children and stepchildren in a household, the parent will usually spare his biological children and abuse the stepchildren. There's your wicked stepmother with the wicked stepsisters going off to the ball, leaving Cinderella behind. On average, there was a study about, in fact, it was in New Mexico about 25 years ago, showing that step parents invested less in their stepchildren's college education than they did their biological children. Step parents play less with their stepchildren than their biological children. Step parents are less likely to bring stepchildren in for medical care than their biological children. This is not because step parents want to beat their stepchildren. This is not the same as the infanticide we talked about among lions and langur monkeys. If you're a step parent and you kill your stepchild, you're not going to make your spouse become sexually receptive. Quite the opposite, in fact. The biological parent may refuse to reproduce with a step parent who is proven to be abusive. Step parents don't necessarily want to hit their kids, or they don't consciously go in thinking, hey, I'm going to beat this kid up. It's just that child raising requires a huge investment of resources, and frequently it is extremely frustrating. And I think that means that step parents have to make more of a conscious effort to parent equitably, and parent fairly, and parent kindly. Um, Kids are really, really annoying. There have been several times when I have threatened to sell my own offspring to the gypsies. Actually, yeah, I probably should not have made that threat, but there have been times I've certainly felt like it. And of course, I never have. This is my son. I wouldn't really do that. But the thinking is that a step parent may not have quite as much defense against taking abuse, against carrying out abuse and neglect. It may take more efforts on their part, and they probably have lower tolerance for the kind of frustrating behavior that kids are known to exhibit. And that's one case where evolutionary psychology, I think, can provide useful insights into human behavior. Not an excuse. I don't think there's ever an excuse for abusing your kids, but greater understanding and maybe eventually the development of better support measures and countermeasures to minimize child abuse happening in the community. Okay, ending on a slightly dark note, we'll move on to speciation next. So I will now stop the recording.